Hi, I'm Ashy and this is Crafty with Ashy. This is a channel where I just try to inspire you to express yourself through your creative outlet. For me, that's usually crocheting, baking, and painting. And today we're going to talk about crocheting. Today we're going to talk about which crochet stitches are yarn eaters. So basically which ones use the most amount of yarn in the least amount of space. And so you might be wondering why you would want to know that. And that is a valid question, because usually I would say we're not wanting to use up all our yarn, right? So I came up with just a few reasons that I could think of why you might want to know the information. The first one is really just to avoid that stitch, right? So if you don't want to use a lot of yarn, you're not going to want to use this stitch, right? But the flip side of that, right, if you do want to use a lot of yarn, some reasons for that would be if you're looking at just making the heaviest, thickest, warmest blanket that you can find, right? The weighted blanket trend is definitely a thing. They can help reduce anxiety. There's multiple benefits of them. But you can actually crochet yourself kind of something similar to a weighted blanket by using some of these really thick stitches. Another kind of same idea is if you wanted to make a nice, really warm, thick scarf, right? You could use one of these really thick, warm stitches. Also, another reason that maybe you have a yarn that you just don't really love. You don't love the color of it, you don't love the texture. You could use one of these thicker stitches just to kind of use up that yarn in a smaller amount of space. So kind of a place where I kind of think that might be applied, right, is if you're doing kind of a stash buster project, right? You have a large project that you're mixing multiple different yarns, multiple different colors, and you have a color that you don't really love, or you have one that you just have a lot of compared to all of your other yarn scraps, right? And you don't want that specific yarn or that specific color to dominate the whole project. And so you would want to use more of that yarn in a smaller amount of space to use it up a little bit quicker, and in terms of the square yardage, right? So you're going to use more of that yarn in the same amount of two-dimensional space. And you can kind of balance out your project that way a little bit. So those are kind of all the reasons that I could think of why you might want to know which stitch uses the most yarn. But if you think of any, let me know in the comments below, because sometimes we get inside our own heads and block our own kind of thought process and creative thoughts. And so it's great to have a community and just be able to talk about different ideas, right? So let me know in the comments below if you have any other ideas. So now let's kind of discuss what I did. So when I was looking up kind of some research on this question, I really couldn't find very much about what stitch uses the most yarn. I found stuff about the least yarn, but not the most yarn. So I decided to kind of test it, and how I did that was I actually crocheted small swatches. I did 2" by 4" swatches, so they're pretty small. I don't have the actual swatches to show you because I had to frog them after so that I could measure out how much yarn I actually used. So I do have pictures though, and you can see the picture of the 5 different swatches that I did here, and you can see they all look different because they're all different stitches, different textures, but they all are the same size in terms of two-dimensional size. They're all 2 by 4 inches. And the stitches that I tested are the popcorn stitch. I chose the popcorn stitch just because it is, you know, it's a big bubble on top basically of the fabric, and I know from experience that the popcorn stitch uses more yarn than the other 2 kind of typical polka dotty type stitches, which are the bobble stitch and that's the name of it. Oh yeah, the puff stitch, right? So sorry. So the popcorn stitch does use more than those 2. So I already knew that. So I chose the popcorn stitch. And then I chose the crocodile stitch, the Celtic Weave stitch, the thermal stitch, and the cotton candy stitch. So 4 of these are very textured, right? You can see that they're really thick, textured fabric. So I chose those because of the texture. The thermal stitch, on the other hand, it's actually a very smooth, flat stitch. And I chose this because everywhere that I was looking for like thick stitches or heavy stitches, I found this touted as being the thickest crochet stitch out there. And so I decided to throw it in my test and see what the results were. It didn't look like it has a lot of texture, right? So I wanted to try it out. The cotton candy stitch I had never really heard of before looking at this, but basically I chose it because it was saying that it's a double texture, right? So texture on both sides, instead of just having the texture on the top side of the fabric and the back side being kind of flat. This one was supposed to have texture on both sides, and it did. So I decided to test that. So without drawing this out any farther, let me show you the results. So here they are. Let's break it down. The popcorn stitch used by far the most yarn out of any of them. It used about 23% more yarn than the second place stitch. That's pretty significant amount of yarn. So you think just that little tiny swatch, and you're using, well, and it doesn't matter what size, it's percent, right? So over a course of a project, you're gonna use about 25%, 23, 25% more yarn with this stitch. So you are really, this is, you know, what they call a yarn eater, right? So very, very textured, a ton of yarn. The second place stitch, it actually surprised me. Thermal stitch for the win, right? So everywhere that said this stitch is really thick, they aren't wrong. This stitch, it's not using as much as the popcorn stitch, but it was a lot more than all of the other stitches, and it was 14% more than the third place. So it used a lot more yarn than the other stitches as well. And this really did surprise me, because when you look at it, it doesn't look that, you know, it's not textured. So, but when you're making it, you'll see that you're essentially stacking your single crochet stitches like front and back, just on top of each other. And so it's like having a double thickness, like you took two single crochet swatches and stuck them together. And that's kind of the thickness of this fabric. So it uses a lot of yarn. It's very thick, but it's nice and flat. So a good application of this, oh, and I forgot to say, up when I was talking about why you'd want to know, one other reason is if you're making something that you need to resist heat, right? So like pot holders or placemats, you're going to want something really thick. And this thermal stitch is really good for that because it doesn't add texture. So you can still kind of manipulate it, fold it, or set something on it without it being kind of wobbly, right? Because you're not having, like the popcorn stitch, you have all the little polka dots. So this one's nice and smooth and flat, but it's super thick. So it's a really good stitch for things like pot holders or placemats that you want to be kind of uniform flat, but you need it to withstand that heat. So really, really nice thick stitch. Now, that's really it. That's all I have. So basically, if you want to use the most amount of yarn in the least amount of two-dimensional space, so, you know, if you're making my swatches 2 inches by 4 inch, right? 2-dimensional. The popcorn stitch is taller if you're looking at 3-dimension. Anyway, none of this matters. If you're looking at doing the most amount of yarn in the least amount of space, go for the popcorn stitch. And if you are interested in learning how to make the popcorn stitch, I do have a very short tutorial. It's about a minute long. You can check it out here for how to make that popcorn stitch. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something today, and just have an awesome day.